The quiet town of Meadowville was never the kind of place where people expected anything out of the ordinary. Streets lined with tall oaks, friendly faces greeting one another. This was a town of routine and peace. But for General Liam Grayson, the night he returned home marked a shift he could never have anticipated. After years serving his country overseas, he thought he'd find solace in the stillness of home, a much-deserved break from chaos. Yet, as he drove down those familiar streets, something happened that shook him to his core. What started as a simple drive home spiraled into a tense encounter he couldn't have seen coming. Why would an officer stop a man who dedicated his life to service? Why did suspicion fill the air in this peaceful town? And what about the crowd, neighbors and strangers alike, who stood frozen in disbelief, witnessing a scene that felt like something out of a nightmare? Meadowville was about to be thrust into a spotlight it had never known, and one man's story was set to challenge everything they thought they understood about justice, respect, and community. So, join us as we delve into Liam's journey in search of justice in today's story. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story inspires you with its message of respect and community spirit, don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more meaningful stories. The sky was a deep indigo as Liam Grayson drove slowly down the familiar streets of Meadowville, the small town that had been his sanctuary since childhood. After 2 years stationed overseas in charge of critical military operations, he had finally come home. Liam's body bore the weight of exhaustion, but his spirit was alive with a calm resolve he hadn't felt in years. The decision-making and constant vigilance required overseas had sharpened his mind, but he felt more than ready to step back into a quieter life. It was late, and the town was nearly asleep, with only the occasional glow of a porch light and the dim flicker of street lamps guiding his path. The contrast to the harsh landscapes he'd navigated abroad struck him instantly. The distant hum of night creatures was the only sound accompanying him, and for the first time in months, he felt himself let down his guard. In Meadowville, there was no echo of choppers, no hum of emergency communications in his ear, only peace. The streets wound like familiar rivers around small, well-kept houses with neatly trimmed lawns. Here and there, a bicycle lay tipped against a fence, and the occasional dog's bark rang out from behind a gate. The town looked as if it had been frozen in time, untouched by the noise and chaos of the world beyond. Meadowville was far from glamorous, but it was rich with a sense of community that Liam had missed desperately. The two-story house where he lived was just around the corner. It was the same house he'd bought with his wife, Ella, years ago, and though they'd lived through the typical ups and downs, the place had become a part of him. He could already imagine the warm light of the living room casting a glow through the front windows, Ella's gentle smile greeting him as he walked through the door. As Liam turned onto his street, a feeling of profound gratitude washed over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt not as a leader or a strategist but simply as Liam. Husband, father, neighbor. His thoughts drifted to his children, Abigail and Noah, who'd been eagerly awaiting his return. He had missed so much, the birthdays, the graduations, and even the mundane daily moments that he now longed for. In his mind's eye, he could picture Abigail's infectious laugh and Noah's thoughtful gaze as they'd huddle around him, listening to stories about his travels. These were the moments he'd cherished more than any medals or accolades, the simple joys of family life he hadn't been able to experience in so long. Pulling into the driveway, he turned off the engine and allowed himself a few quiet moments. He wanted to savor the stillness, to truly feel he was back in Meadowville. There was a light breeze in the air, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass and the faintest hint of pine. The chill of the night air seeped through his open window, grounding him in the reality of his return. For a moment, he closed his eyes, breathing in deeply, letting the familiar scents and sounds envelop him. Here, in this modest neighborhood, he was a world away from the tension of military briefings and the split-second decisions that determined lives. With a final deep breath, Liam got out of the car and walked up to his house, feeling a weight he hadn't noticed before start to lift from his shoulders. The town was quiet, with only the occasional shuffle of leaves, and he could hear his own footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path leading to the door. The sky was blanketed in stars, a spectacle he rarely got to see during his deployment. He marveled at the constancy of it. The same sky that had been above him in foreign lands was now watching over him here, back where he belonged. Inside, Ella had left the porch light on, a soft welcome after his long journey. The yellow light cast warm, familiar shadows across the doorway, making the house feel both inviting and alive. He turned the handle quietly, stepping into the home he'd missed for so long. The air was filled with a comforting scent, a mix of lavender and vanilla from a candle Ella loved, blending with the faint aroma of a late-night dinner she'd likely prepared just in case he arrived hungry. Ella was waiting in the living room, a gentle smile on her face that radiated warmth. She rose from her chair as he walked in, moving toward him in a few soft steps. For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the silence wrap around them like an embrace. Then, without words, they held each other close, a quiet reunion that spoke volumes. After all the words, calls, and messages exchanged across continents, nothing could replace this simple touch, this presence. He pulled back slightly, looking at her, memorizing every detail. Ella had been his rock, managing the household while he was away and caring for their children. They exchanged soft smiles, and he could see in her eyes a depth of understanding. Ella had always known what it took for him to do his job, and despite the sacrifices, she had always supported him. This was home. This was the life he'd fought to protect, and tonight, he felt whole again. Soon, Liam moved to the window, glancing out over the quiet neighborhood. The streets lay silent, interrupted only by the faint rustling of the trees. He could see, just barely, the glow of his neighbor's light across the street and the outline of the trees that bordered the yard. A quiet pride stirred within him, not for his military rank, but for the life they'd built here in Meadowville, the small, sturdy home that stood as a symbol of everything he held dear. He thought of the backyard where he and the kids would run barefoot on the grass, of the kitchen where he and Ella had shared countless cups of coffee in the early morning hours before the world was fully awake. Later, as they sat down at the kitchen table, Liam's gaze fell on the ordinary things. A coffee mug, a small vase of flowers Ella had placed on the counter. These were the little details of life he'd missed. The simplicity of a meal at his own table, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards underfoot. Each sound, each familiar sight, seemed to wash over him, reminding him of how precious these small things truly were. The challenges of the battlefield, the complexity of his responsibilities, all seemed to fade in the face of the everyday life he had missed so deeply. The night wore on, but Liam felt no desire to rush. He savored each moment, each glance at Ella, each quiet beat of home. As he prepared to turn in for the night, he took one last look out the window at the small, sleeping town of Meadowville. Tomorrow, he would reunite with the children, resume his role as a father, and begin rediscovering his place in this peaceful life he had yearned for. But for tonight, he was content to simply be here, to let the weight of his journey settle and fade away in the comforting arms of home. Liam Grayson had been driving in silence for a while, savoring the rare quiet of Meadowville's late-night streets. The headlights of his SUV swept gently over the road as he passed rows of familiar houses and winding suburban lanes. The crisp, cool air flowed through his open window, a welcome change after months of unrelenting heat and tension overseas. The simple, everyday task of driving home felt almost surreal after so long. As the hum of the engine rolled on, his thoughts drifted to the weekend ahead with his family, savoring the peace he finally felt. Then, in the rearview mirror, he noticed something, a pair of headlights following close behind. At first, Liam paid it little mind. Cars passed through Meadowville every now and then, and he assumed it was just a neighbor or someone else making a late-night drive. But as he continued, he noticed that the headlights didn't fade away or take a different turn. Instead, they remained fixed right behind him, uncomfortably close. Liam frowned, glancing back in the mirror. The vehicle was clearly a police cruiser, its silhouette unmistakable even in the dim glow of the streetlights. With each turn he took, it followed. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, a slight unease tugging at him. He was careful to stay within the speed limit, his driving cautious and steady, but the patrol car stayed glued to him, too close for comfort. The unsettling feeling grew as the cruiser's headlights intensified in his mirror. Liam reminded himself that he hadn't done anything wrong, that there was no reason for concern. He was a law-abiding citizen, a respected military leader. But as the minutes ticked by and the police car remained on his tail, that familiar calm began to waver. Suddenly, the cruiser's red and blue lights blazed to life, flashing with an intensity that illuminated the street around him. The unmistakable signal to pull over sent a jolt through him. Liam's mind raced. It was a small town, and Meadowville officers typically only stopped drivers they recognized or suspected of serious misconduct. For a moment, he debated whether to simply continue, convinced there was no reason for him to be pulled over. But his training reminded him to stay calm, to follow protocol. With a sigh, he eased his vehicle to the side of the road and parked. He placed the car in park, inhaling deeply to center himself. His instincts as a military leader kicked in, reminding him to stay composed and deliberate in his actions. He rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, waiting for the officer to approach. It was a routine he'd practiced and drilled into his soldiers for years, a procedure meant to keep everyone safe. But here, on this quiet street in his own hometown, it felt oddly foreign. The officer approached, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dim light as he neared Liam's window. Liam glanced up, catching a glimpse of the man's face in the streetlight. The officer, whose name badge read D. Reilly, looked young, his posture tense and his expression unreadable. Reilly exuded a sort of rigid authority, an air that suggested he was more focused on enforcing power than understanding the person he was dealing with. "License and registration," Reilly barked, his tone sharp and commanding. There was no courtesy, no explanation, just the order, delivered with an air of suspicion that caught Liam off guard. Liam held up his hands slightly to show compliance, moving slowly to reach for his wallet. "Of course, officer. I'm reaching for my ID now," he said, his voice calm but firm. He wanted to ensure the officer felt comfortable, to avoid any sense of threat. Years of discipline had taught him that respect and measured responses were key in tense situations. He handed over his license and registration, then waited as Reilly examined them. The officer's expression shifted slightly as he studied the documents, but he said nothing. Reilly's eyes flicked back to Liam, scrutinizing him with a look that was difficult to read but unmistakably judgmental. There was no recognition in his gaze, no acknowledgement of who Liam might be. To Reilly, he was simply another driver to be controlled, another possible threat. "Step out of the vehicle," Reilly ordered suddenly, his voice colder than before. Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the demand. He'd anticipated questions, or maybe a reason for the stop, but the request to exit the car felt unnecessary. Still, he complied, knowing better than to argue. As Liam opened the door and stepped out, Reilly moved closer, his hand resting on his holster in a way that seemed overly cautious. Liam was a decorated general, trained to de-escalate conflicts, yet here he was, in his own town, being treated like a criminal. He forced himself to remain calm, ignoring the small surge of irritation rising within him. "Officer, is there a specific reason for this stop?" Liam asked, his tone measured, hoping to understand the officer's motives. But Reilly offered no clarification. Instead, he moved in closer, his face set in a hard line. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Reilly instructed, his voice carrying an edge that bordered on hostility. A flash of disbelief crossed Liam's face, but he didn't let it linger. Complying, he turned slowly, placing his hands on the cool metal of his car's hood. The gesture felt humiliating, a stark reminder of the lack of control he had in this situation. He had led troops through some of the world's most dangerous places, yet here, in this ordinary setting, he was rendered powerless. Reilly's grip was firm and unrelenting as he pressed Liam's arms against the hood, his actions laced with unnecessary force. Liam felt a mix of confusion and frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. He had complied with every instruction, followed every rule, and yet he was treated as if he were a dangerous threat. "This is entirely unnecessary, officer," Liam said, his voice low but steady. He wanted to maintain control over his tone, not letting his frustration get the better of him. But it was difficult to ignore the injustice of it all. Reilly didn't respond. Instead, he focused on patting down Liam, moving with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. He seemed uninterested in who Liam was or why he was here, intent only on asserting his authority. The minutes dragged on, each second amplifying the surreal quality of the moment. A few neighbors had begun to notice the commotion, watching from their porches or through half-open windows. Some held up phones, recording the scene in silence. Liam caught glimpses of their faces, some shocked, others simply curious, but none of them intervened. He was acutely aware of their gazes, feeling exposed under the harsh light of the patrol car. Reilly finally finished his search, stepping back slightly. He gave no explanation, no indication of what he suspected or why he had singled Liam out. It was as if he were waiting for Liam to make a mistake, to show some sign of resistance that would justify his aggressive approach. "Am I free to go?" Liam asked finally, his tone still steady but tinged with an underlying edge. He had remained composed, but this treatment was beyond any reasonable protocol, and he couldn't ignore the frustration building inside him. Reilly stared at him for a long moment, his expression hard. Finally, he muttered, "Don't go anywhere just yet," before retreating to his cruiser, leaving Liam standing by the hood of his car. Liam took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. This was not the place for anger, not the time to let his frustration take control. But as he waited, hands still on the car, he felt a weight of indignation settle over him. In his own town, where he had served and sacrificed, he was treated with suspicion, his status rendered invisible. Moments later, Reilly returned, looking at Liam with the same cold scrutiny. "All clear," he said flatly, handing back the license and registration as if nothing unusual had occurred. Liam accepted the documents without a word, maintaining his composure. But as he got back into his car and drove away, a lingering sense of anger and disbelief simmered within him. The encounter had been brief, but it left a lasting mark, a reminder that even here, in his quiet hometown, he was not immune to the prejudice that lay beneath the surface. The quiet streets felt different now, their peace tainted by the memory of Reilly's aggressive actions. And as Liam drove the remaining distance to his home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a story he hadn't anticipated. As Liam Grayson drove away from Officer Reilly, he felt an unsettling mixture of anger and humiliation. He had endured countless challenges, commanded soldiers, and made life-or-death decisions in war zones. Yet here he was, targeted and treated with disrespect in his own town. The quiet streets of Meadowville now felt heavy, cloaked in a tension he couldn't shake. But his relief was short-lived. Within moments, those same red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror again. Liam felt a pulse of disbelief surge through him. He had already gone through a search and questioning. What could Reilly possibly want now? His mind raced, but he knew he had no choice. Sighing, he pulled over once more, glancing around at the empty street. This time, however, he noticed a few curious bystanders on the sidewalk, their eyes fixed on the scene. Reilly approached, his expression even harder, his movements more determined. Liam rolled down his window, meeting the officer's cold gaze with a steady calm, though his heart pounded beneath the surface. "Step out of the vehicle." "Now," Reilly demanded, his voice laced with irritation. Liam's mind reeled. He had already complied once, already shown every sign of cooperation, but it was clear that this was going to escalate whether he wanted it to or not. With a deep breath, he exited the vehicle, keeping his hands visible, making no sudden movements. "Hands on the hood." "Spread your legs," Reilly instructed, moving closer with an intensity that felt unnecessary. Liam complied, his military training kicking in, guiding him to follow instructions precisely. He'd been through more intense scenarios than this, and he learned to keep calm under pressure. But as Reilly approached, his steps quick and heavy, Liam could feel a shift in the air. Without warning, Reilly hand-gripped Liam's arm, yanking it behind his back with an unexpected force. The sudden aggression caught him off guard, and before he could react, Reilly had slammed him against the hood of the car, the cold metal pressing into his cheek. Pain shot through his shoulder as Reilly twisted his arm back, pinning it in place. "Resisting, huh?" Reilly spat, his voice filled with a venom that shocked Liam. Liam tried to speak, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not resisting, officer. There's no need for—" But Reilly wasn't listening. His grip tightened, pushing Liam harder against the car. The world around Liam felt surreal, the calm town he knew fading into the background as he tried to process what was happening. He could feel the eyes of the bystanders on him, could see a few phones raised, recording the scene in silent disbelief. The humiliation of it all struck him deeply, but he knew he had to remain calm. Reilly pulled out his handcuffs, snapping them onto Liam's wrists with an unnecessary roughness that made Liam wince. The cuffs dug into his skin, cold and unforgiving, as Reilly forced his hands behind his back. "This is excessive," Liam said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. He wanted to keep his dignity, to handle the situation with the same composure he'd shown in combat. But Reilly's aggressive stance and unyielding force made it clear he wasn't interested in a peaceful interaction. A murmur swept through the small crowd that had gathered nearby. The expressions on their faces ranged from shock to anger to silent concern. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his brow furrowed as he called out, "Hey, what's going on here?" "He didn't do anything." Reilly shot the man a look, his face darkening. "Mind your own business," he snapped before returning his focus to Liam, seemingly unfazed by the growing attention. Liam's jaw clenched, but he kept his eyes forward, refusing to give Reilly the satisfaction of seeing any reaction. He had seen this kind of hostility before, had dealt with far worse, but it felt different here, in the very town where he had built his life, his home. As Reilly continued to search him, roughly patting him down with more force than necessary, Liam felt a surge of indignation rising. He had gone through all the proper channels, complied with every request, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in front of his neighbors. Each push, each shove from Reilly seemed to amplify the feeling of helplessness, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The murmuring from the bystanders grew louder, some voicing their disapproval more openly. "What's he done wrong?" someone called out, their tone filled with incredulity. Reilly ignored them, his focus unwavering as he tightened the cuffs even further. "You people never know when to listen," he muttered, the disdain in his voice unmistakable. "You people?" Liam repeated, his tone measured, but there was a fire in his eyes. He couldn't ignore the implication, the dismissive tone. But Reilly continued as if he hadn't heard, his actions methodical, each movement calculated to assert his authority. Liam turned his head slightly, addressing Reilly with as much calm as he could muster. "Officer, I've complied with every instruction. There's no reason for this treatment." But Reilly's face twisted with contempt, as though Liam's words were an affront. He leaned in, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "Out here, I decide the rules," he said. "And you're just another suspect until proven otherwise." The words hit Liam harder than any physical blow could. The weight of them sank in, each syllable a reminder of how quickly respect could be stripped away, how easily authority could be abused. He had spent years serving his country, years fighting to protect freedom and uphold justice, yet none of that seemed to matter here. In this moment, he was nothing more than a target of someone else's power trip. Reilly yanked him upright, the handcuffs biting into his wrists, the metal cold and unyielding. Liam felt a wave of frustration wash over him, but he fought to keep his composure, to stay calm. He knew that any sign of resistance, any hint of anger, would only serve to justify Reilly's actions in the officer's eyes. Behind him, the small crowd had grown larger. More people were watching, some recording the scene, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. A woman in the crowd called out, "He's a military officer. Show some respect." Reilly ignored her, focusing entirely on Liam, his grip unrelenting. "I don't care who you are," he sneered. "When I give an order, you follow it. End of story." The disdain in Reilly's voice was unmistakable, and Liam felt the burn of humiliation beneath his calm exterior. Here he was, a man who had commanded respect, who had led others with integrity, and yet he was being reduced to a mere target of an officer's power. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of his neighbors and fellow townspeople, their expressions a mixture of concern and disbelief. The onlookers had seen him as he truly was, a man coming home after years of service. But Reilly had seen only a threat, only someone to be controlled. For a moment, he met the eyes of a young boy in the crowd, the child's face filled with confusion and fear. The boy looked at him as if asking, "Why is this happening?" And for the first time, Liam felt a pang of shame, not for himself, but for the system that allowed this, for the power dynamics that had led to this moment. Reilly finally released him, stepping back with a look of triumph, as if he had won some unspoken battle. "Stay here," he ordered, before turning back to his cruiser, leaving Liam standing alone, hands cuffed, in front of his car. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken outrage of the crowd, the disapproval written clearly on their faces. Liam stood tall, his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to let the humiliation drag him down. He was not going to let this moment define him, not here, not now. As Reilly returned, unlocking the cuffs with a rough twist, Liam felt a surge of relief, but also a lingering sense of anger. The encounter had been a harsh reminder that respect and authority could be stripped away in an instant, that years of service and sacrifice could be disregarded by someone determined to see only a threat. As Liam Grayson stood by his car, the sting of humiliation fresh, he noticed another set of headlights approaching, casting a faint glow over the scene. The police cruiser pulled to a stop, and from it stepped Officer Rachel Taylor. She moved swiftly, her face set with concern as she took in the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, the tense faces of the onlookers, and the lingering hostility in the air. Her eyes swept over Liam, his shoulders squared, a proud but tired stance that seemed out of place in this quiet town at this late hour. "Officer Reilly," she called, her tone professional yet pointed. She noticed immediately that something was off. The intensity of Reilly's stance, his unrelenting glare directed at Liam, spoke of something beyond standard protocol. Reilly barely turned to acknowledge her, but there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Got it under control, Taylor," he said, his voice dismissive, still radiating the authority he'd wielded so forcefully moments before. He turned back to Liam, his hands still lingering near his holster, his posture unyielding. But Officer Taylor wasn't convinced. As she stepped closer, her eyes met Liam's, and something shifted in her expression. Recognition dawned slowly but unmistakably, her gaze sharpening as she took in his face, his stature, and the calm steadiness in his eyes. She'd seen that face before, not here in Meadowville but on the news, in profiles of military leaders. Her mind raced as she recalled his name, his rank, the stories of his service. General Liam Grayson. The realization hit her like a shockwave. "General Grayson?" she asked, her voice softening with respect but carrying an urgency that Reilly could not ignore. She stepped between them, positioning herself subtly but clearly as a barrier. Reilly's face contorted with confusion, his eyes narrowing as he looked from Taylor to Liam, clearly baffled. Liam nodded, his voice calm but heavy. "Yes, officer," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of someone who was used to command but who had been forced into submission. It was a tone both dignified and tired, marked by years of experience and resilience. Reilly faltered, the realization settling over him as his gaze shifted back to Liam. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. "General?" His face flushed, the color draining from his skin as he took in the full weight of what he had done. This man, the one he had humiliated and treated like a common criminal, was a high-ranking military officer, a decorated leader who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Taylor turned to Reilly, her eyes hardening. "What exactly is going on here, Officer Reilly?" she asked, her voice low but laced with an authority he hadn't heard from her before. Reilly's bravado seemed to crumble as he opened his mouth to respond, stammering slightly. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He took a step back, as if physical distance could somehow undo the events of the last few minutes. "I didn't realize who he was." Taylor's expression grew even graver, her voice firm. "And that should matter because," she asked, a hint of rebuke in her tone. She knew as well as anyone that an officer's duty wasn't to enforce authority based on rank or status, but to uphold justice for every individual, regardless of who they were. Reilly stammered, at a loss for words. The weight of his actions hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, as he grappled with the truth. He had allowed his own biases to guide his actions, ignoring protocol, ignoring respect, ignoring the basic humanity of the man he had detained. The crowd around them had grown larger, a mixture of neighbors, strangers, and even a few familiar faces who'd come out to witness the unfolding drama. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers as they began to understand who Liam was, the realization dawning in their expressions. Phones were still raised, cameras capturing every second, recording every expression, every tense silence. Liam stood silent, his gaze steady as he observed the shift in Reilly's demeanor. He could see the cracks beginning to form, the growing awareness in the younger officer's eyes. Part of him wanted to say something, to express the frustration that burned within him, but he held back, recognizing that this moment wasn't his to control. This was Reilly reckoning, a moment of clarity forced upon him by the presence of his colleague and the unspoken judgment of the watching crowd. "Reilly, we need to talk," Taylor said, her voice softer but firm, as though urging him to see the gravity of his actions. "You can't just treat people this way. This isn't how we do things." Reilly swallowed hard, his throat dry as he looked from Taylor to Liam. He wanted to protest, to explain himself, but he knew deep down that there was nothing he could say to make this right. He had acted out of pride, out of a need to assert control, and now he was faced with the consequences. "I thought," Reilly began, his voice shaky. "I thought he was suspicious." He could hear how hollow his own words sounded, how flimsy his justification was in the face of what he had done. Taylor looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "Suspicious," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "Did he give you any reason to believe that? Did he resist? Show any aggression?" Her questions came rapid-fire, leaving him no room to maneuver. Reilly's face flushed, his gaze dropping to the ground as he realized how baseless his actions had been. He shook his head slowly, shame flooding his expression. "No," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "He didn't do anything. I just assumed." The admission hung heavy in the air, a confession of his own failings, his own prejudice. The crowd murmured softly, their judgment clear as they watched him. The recording phones, the attentive eyes, all served as a reminder that this wasn't just between him and Liam. It was a public reckoning, an accountability he hadn't anticipated. Taylor turned to Liam, her face softened but still resolute. "General Grayson, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine regret. "This never should have happened. Please know that we're going to make this right." Liam looked at her, a brief nod acknowledging her apology. But he could see in her expression the weight of her own realization, the silent shame that came from knowing her fellow officer had abused his authority. It was a weight she carried not only as a colleague, but as someone who had chosen to serve and protect with integrity. Reilly, still standing a few paces back, looked at Liam with an expression torn between apology and regret. He wanted to speak, to find some way to explain himself, but every word he thought of felt hollow, meaningless. He had crossed a line, and there was no erasing what he had done. The respect he'd assumed would always be his by virtue of his badge had slipped away, leaving him feeling exposed, vulnerable, and powerless. In the silence that followed, Taylor stepped closer to Liam, signaling with a small nod that he was free to leave, that the confrontation had come to an end. Liam looked at Reilly one last time, his gaze steady, a mixture of understanding and sadness in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. As he walked back to his car, Liam felt the tension begin to dissipate, the burden of the encounter easing with each step. He was grateful to Taylor, to the neighbors who had stood by and watched, who had voiced their objections. It was a reminder that, despite moments like these, there were still people willing to do what was right, willing to stand up against unfairness and bias. Reilly remained rooted to the spot, watching as Liam drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the night. The crowd slowly dispersed, the murmurs dying down as people returned to their homes. But the judgment in their eyes lingered, the unspoken disappointment settling over him like a cloud. He knew that this was only the beginning of his reckoning, that he would have to confront the reality of his own actions, his own prejudices. Taylor looked at him, her expression firm but not without compassion. "You need to think about what happened here, Reilly," she said quietly. "This wasn't just a mistake. You crossed a line, and now you have to face that." Reilly nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes filled with a newfound awareness. He had been wrong in ways he hadn't even understood until this moment. And as he stood there, alone in the dim light of the street, he realized that the weight of his actions was something he would carry with him for a long time. As the last of the bystanders disappeared into the night, Reilly felt the silence settle around him, the quiet streets bearing witness to a moment he would never forget. This wasn't just about one man's authority over another. It was a reminder that respect and humanity could never be taken for granted, that every decision held consequences, and that sometimes the greatest battles were the ones fought within oneself. By the next morning, Meadowville was a different place. The sleepy town had erupted into a state of buzzing intensity, with whispers and hurried conversations flowing through its streets, shops, and homes. The video of Officer Reilly's confrontation with Liam Grayson had found its way onto social media overnight, and by sunrise, it had already gathered thousands of views, stirring strong reactions both within Meadowville and far beyond. The video was short but intense, showing Liam, calm and composed, being forcibly detained and handcuffed in front of his neighbors, the expressions of onlookers shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. Voices in the crowd could be heard questioning the officer's behavior, their frustration clear as the footage continued. Comments poured in, each more impassioned than the last, demanding accountability and expressing outrage at the way a decorated military general had been treated in his own hometown. As word of the incident spread, more people began sharing the video, posting it with hashtags calling for justice and accountability. Within hours, the story had gained traction not only among locals but across social media platforms, and even a few news outlets picked it up. Clips circulated on television and online, showing Reilly's aggressive stance and the growing concern of the crowd. The hashtags #JusticeForGrayson and #StandWithLiam began trending, amplifying the story and gathering support from every corner of the internet. Back at home, Liam watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment. He hadn't anticipated the incident to gain such traction, hadn't expected that moment on a quiet Meadowville street to ignite a movement. But here it was, expanding beyond his control, becoming something much larger than he had ever intended. While the public outcry continued to grow, Liam made a deliberate choice to remain silent. He felt that rushing to speak out would only add fuel to the fire, and he wasn't ready for that. Instead, he chose to focus on what he had longed for most during his years of service, his family. The warmth and familiarity of home had a healing quality, a grounding presence that steadied him in the midst of the media frenzy outside. Ella, his wife, understood his decision, her support unwavering as she shielded him from the constant noise of calls and messages, allowing him to find solace in their shared space. Yet, as the days passed, Liam became acutely aware of how far-reaching the consequences of that night had become. People from all over Meadowville gathered in front of the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Grayson, equal treatment for all, and accountability now." The crowd was a mix of faces, young and old, people of different backgrounds, all united in a call for justice and change. At first, the gatherings were small, limited to concerned neighbors and community members. But as the video continued to circulate, drawing attention from other towns and even major cities, the protests swelled. What began as a local issue now felt like a national moment, a rallying point for those frustrated by years of similar stories, similar injustices. In Meadowville's town square, people gathered daily, their voices rising in unison, their determination growing with each passing hour. Speakers stood before the crowd, sharing their own experiences of discrimination, of feeling voiceless in a world that sometimes saw them as threats rather than individuals. Their stories resonated with the crowd, creating a sense of shared purpose and solidarity. Liam's story had become a symbol, a catalyst for voices that had been waiting for an opportunity to be heard. While Liam kept to himself, the town was abuzz with discussions about the meaning of the protests. Some felt the protests were a long overdue reckoning, a necessary movement toward change. Others worried about the town's reputation, their discomfort palpable as they discussed the situation in hushed voices. But despite the varying opinions, the sense of urgency, the demand for accountability, could not be ignored. The momentum was undeniable, growing stronger as each new day brought more supporters, more people who felt compelled to add their voices to the call for change. Meanwhile, Officer Rachel Taylor watched the unfolding events with a heavy heart. She had been at the scene, had witnessed Reilly's treatment of Liam, and knew firsthand the injustice he had suffered. Taylor felt torn between her duty to the police force and her own sense of right and wrong. She couldn't ignore the wrongdoing, couldn't pretend that Reilly's actions had been justified. She understood the power of the protests, the importance of standing up against mistreatment, and she found herself questioning her role in the department, wondering how she could help bring about change. In the quiet moments at home, Liam tried to shield his children from the turmoil outside. He wanted Abigail and Noah to remember Meadowville as the peaceful town they had grown up in, not as the place where their father had been mistreated. But even as he tried to create a sense of normalcy, he knew that his silence could only last so long. The world was watching, waiting for him to speak, to lend his voice to the movement that had emerged from his own experience. One evening, as he sat with Ella on their back porch, the soft glow of twilight washing over them, she looked at him, her gaze filled with understanding. "They're waiting for you," she said gently, her voice laced with both support and encouragement. "You know that, right? They need to hear from you." Liam nodded slowly, looking out at the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. He knew she was right, that eventually he would have to step forward, to acknowledge the role he had unwittingly played in sparking this movement. But he also knew that he needed time, to process, to consider what he wanted to say, to ensure that when he finally spoke, his words would carry the weight of not only his own experience, but of the countless others who had felt the same injustice. Days turned into weeks, and the protests showed no signs of slowing down. The energy in the town square was electric, charged with a sense of purpose that felt unbreakable. Community leaders, activists, and residents who had once remained silent now found themselves at the forefront, organizing marches, speaking to the press, and ensuring that Liam's story stayed in the spotlight. Signs reading, "Justice for all," "No more silence," and "We stand with Liam," covered the walls of the town square, symbols of a united front, a collective demand for change. The protests spread beyond Meadowville, with supporters from nearby towns joining in, holding their own vigils and demonstrations in solidarity. News outlets continued to follow the story, capturing the spirit of the movement as it unfolded, broadcasting the voices of those who called for justice. The story had become bigger than any one person, bigger than Liam himself. It had become a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for those who believed in fairness and equality. Amidst the flurry of protests and demands, Liam held on to the support of his family, grateful for their unwavering presence. He cherished the small moments with Abigail and Noah, the laughter that echoed through their home, the comfort of Ella's hand in his. These were the moments that kept him grounded, that reminded him of what he was truly fighting for. In the stillness of the night, Liam found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the men and women he had led, the soldiers who had looked to him for guidance, and the responsibility he had carried on his shoulders for years. This new role was different, unexpected, but the weight of it was just as profound. He understood now that he couldn't remain silent forever, that his silence would only add to the frustration, to the feeling of being unheard that so many people shared. As he sat alone, watching the moonlight cast soft shadows across his yard, Liam felt a growing sense of resolve. The time for silence was ending. When he finally stepped forward, he wanted his words to reflect not only his own pain but the collective struggle of those who had faced similar experiences. This wasn't just about him. It was about a broader fight for respect, for dignity, for the right to be seen and treated as equals. With each passing day, Liam felt the anticipation build, a quiet pressure urging him to add his voice to the movement. He knew that when he finally spoke, the town, and perhaps the world, would listen. For now, he held his family close, drawing strength from their presence, preparing himself for the moment when his words would carry the weight of a community's hopes for justice. The day Liam Grayson and Officer Adam Reilly met face-to-face was one of those rare days in Meadowville when the air felt still, as if even the town itself knew that something significant was about to happen. The protest had continued for weeks, and the story of Liam's mistreatment had gained national attention. Calls for reform echoed not only through the streets of Meadowville but in cities and towns beyond, where people held signs and chanted slogans inspired by the events in this quiet town. The meeting had been arranged by Officer Rachel Taylor, who had been instrumental in de-escalating the initial incident. Recognizing the importance of a dialogue between Liam and Reilly, she wanted them to have a space to address what had happened, not only for their own peace, but as a step toward healing for the community. The meeting took place at the Meadowville Community Center, a neutral ground where discussions could happen without the weight of authority pressing down on either man. Liam arrived first, stepping into the room with a composed expression, though an underlying tension lingered in his posture. He felt prepared, knowing he would have to confront not only his own pain but the man who had caused it. Sitting down, he took a deep breath, centering himself, ready to say what had been building inside him since that night. Moments later, Reilly entered, his steps hesitant, his expression conflicted. He was far from the confident officer who had asserted his authority on that quiet street. Today, he was a man facing the reality of his actions, his posture weighed down by the shame and regret he could no longer ignore. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, General Grayson," Reilly began, his voice low and uncertain. He hadn't used Liam's rank before, but now, in this moment, the title felt like a form of respect he was compelled to offer, an acknowledgement of the man's service and standing. Liam nodded, acknowledging Reilly's attempt at respect. "Thank you for showing up," he replied evenly, his tone controlled but with an intensity that made Reilly shift slightly in his seat. Liam's eyes held a quiet power, a calmness earned through years of experience, yet there was an unmistakable sadness there, a sorrow Reilly knew he was partly responsible for. The silence between them was thick, stretching as they both gathered their thoughts. Finally, Liam broke the silence, his voice steady but edged with pain. "I don't think you fully understand what you put me through that night," he began, looking directly at Reilly. The humiliation, the anger, the disappointment, it was more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. You reduced me to something I never thought I'd be in my own town. A suspect, a threat. Reilly swallowed, his face pale as he listened. He opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it, realizing that now was the time to listen, not to explain himself. "I've spent my life serving this country," Liam continued, his gaze unwavering. "I've led troops, made decisions that affected lives, and I thought that counted for something, that it meant something. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All you saw was someone who, in your mind, needed to be controlled. You didn't see me as a person. You saw a threat." The weight of Liam's words settled heavily over Reilly, pressing down on him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He looked down, unable to meet Liam's eyes. The shame he felt was nearly suffocating, his mind replaying that night, realizing with painful clarity the injustice of his own actions. Liam's voice softened but didn't lose its edge. "What hurts the most isn't what you did to me personally," he said. "What hurts is knowing that people face this every day, that the uniform you wear represents safety to some and fear to others. And that's a burden you need to confront." Reilly finally looked up, his face etched with regret. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't take back what I did. I can't undo the damage or erase the shame of my actions. But I want to make it right, somehow. I need to make it right." Liam studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity in Reilly's face. He saw a man wrestling with his own limitations, his own biases, and for the first time, perhaps understanding the true weight of his role. "I didn't expect you to come here with answers," Liam said after a moment. "I don't expect forgiveness or a quick fix. But if you're serious about making this right, then you need to start by understanding the impact you have on the people you serve. You can't walk around with that badge, that authority, without recognizing the power it holds and the responsibility that comes with it. Reilly nodded slowly, his gaze unsteady but resolute. "I do want to change," he said, his voice firmer. "I want to be better than the person I was that night. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm willing to put in the work. I want to learn, to really understand what it means to serve, not just enforce the law, but to serve the people." The sincerity in his words struck Liam, and for a moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had faced men in combat who had learned from their mistakes, who had grown despite the darkness they had once carried. If Reilly was willing to confront his own biases, to truly change, then perhaps something meaningful could come from this. "Actions speak louder than words, Officer Reilly," Liam said, his tone both challenging and encouraging. "You have a long road ahead of you, and it won't be easy. But if you're serious, then you need to start by listening, really listening, to the people around you. You need to understand their experiences, their fears. That's the only way you'll ever bridge this divide." Reilly nodded, his eyes reflecting a new understanding. He could feel the shift within himself, the beginning of a journey he hadn't anticipated, but one he knew he had to take. The protests, the anger from the community, the look in Liam's eyes, all of it had forced him to confront the person he had become and the person he wanted to be. "I know I don't deserve your trust, not after what I did," Reilly admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "But I'm asking for a chance to earn it back. Not just from you, but from this community." Liam regarded him with a measured gaze, a hint of empathy softening his expression. "Trust isn't given, officer. It's earned," he said, "and you'll need to prove, to everyone here, that you're willing to do what it takes to earn it back. But that's not something I can give you. It's something you'll have to work for, every day, through every choice you make." A silence fell between them, but it was no longer tense. It was a silence of understanding, of shared acknowledgement of the journey they both faced. Liam, as he healed from the hurt and betrayal, and Reilly, as he began the hard work of transformation. It was a silent agreement, a bridge between them be Rachel Taylor-Ruelt on honesty and a shared commitment to do better. As the conversation came to a close, Reilly reached out his hand. It was a tentative gesture, one filled with humility and respect. After a brief moment, Liam took his hand, a firm but restrained handshake sealing a mutual understanding. "Thank you for this," Reilly said, his voice steady. "I know it's only the beginning, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. For you, for everyone." Liam nodded, a quiet strength in his gaze. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "Thank me when you've proven to yourself and to this town that you can truly make a difference." With those words, they parted ways, each man walking out of the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. Liam felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a glimmer of hope that perhaps this encounter would lead to something meaningful. For Reilly, the conversation had ignited a resolve, a determination to take the first steps toward change, to confront his own prejudices and work toward becoming the officer he should have been all along. As the door closed behind them, both men knew that their journey was far from over. But in that moment, they had laid the foundation for something new, a chance for growth, for understanding, and, perhaps, for a better future. Weeks after the meeting between Liam Grayson and Officer Adam Reilly, Meadowville had changed. The protests had swelled beyond the town square, with people from surrounding communities joining to demand a reform not only in Meadowville but in towns across the country. Liam's story had become a powerful symbol of justice, an example of the necessity for a more compassionate, equitable approach to policing. He hadn't set out to inspire a movement, but the movement had found him, resonating deeply with those who saw their own stories reflected in his. The justice movement had become more organized over time, with local leaders coming together to advocate for systemic changes. They held rallies, wrote petitions, and spoke with public officials about the need for accountability, transparency, and policies that prioritized humanity over control. Liam, though initially hesitant to step into the public eye, began to realize that his voice could serve as a bridge between the community's demands and the systems that govern them. One evening, he stood before a packed room in the Meadowville Community Center. Residents, community activists, and city officials filled the seats, their faces a mixture of anticipation determination, and hope. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their expectations, but also their trust. This wasn't about him. It was about something larger, something that transcended one man's experience and spoke to a shared desire for fairness and dignity. "Thank you all for being here," Liam began, his voice steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. "I never imagined that my return home would lead to something like this. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that moments of hardship can reveal hard truths, truths we sometimes choose to ignore until we no longer can." He paused, his gaze moving across the crowd. "For too long, people have been treated as if their value is something to be questioned, something conditional. We know that's not true. We know that every person deserves respect. Every person deserves to be seen as human. That's the only way we can begin to rebuild trust." The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces mirroring the pain and resolve that came with the knowledge of such truths. They had all seen or experienced moments like the one Liam endured, moments where assumptions, biases, and unchecked authority had overshadowed justice. "What happened to me isn't unique," Liam continued, his voice softening. "It's a part of a larger issue, one that impacts far more people than it should. I was lucky. I had people willing to record, to speak up, to make sure that my voice was heard. But there are so many who aren't as fortunate, who suffer in silence. This movement is about them as much as it's about me. It's about making sure that no one has to go through that alone." As he spoke, he felt a shift in the room, a collective understanding, a deepening commitment to the cause they had come to represent. He could see it in the faces of the people around him, their pain, their resilience, their hope. Each person was there because they believed that change was not only possible but necessary. One of the lessons Liam emphasized that night was the importance of empathy and understanding, even in roles of authority. He shared his belief that when police officers enter their communities, they should do so not with suspicion but with a sense of service, with the goal of creating a safer, more supportive environment for everyone. "Policing isn't just about enforcing laws," he said. "It's about building relationships. It's about fostering trust. It's about understanding the people you serve." This idea struck a chord with the community. People knew that what they were asking for wasn't a radical change but a simple, humane approach to governance and policing. They wanted officers who were willing to listen, who would engage with the community, who saw themselves as part of the fabric of that community. Liam's experience had illuminated the power dynamics that existed, but it also pointed toward a solution, one that relied on empathy, education, and accountability. Over time, the movement became more than just a series of rallies and speeches. The community began implementing concrete changes, working with the local government to draft new policies that emphasized transparency and communication. They pushed for community oversight committees, made up of residents who could review and address complaints of misconduct. These committees would ensure that officers like Reilly were held accountable, that they understood the impact of their actions, and that the people of Meadowville could feel confident their voices would be heard. At the heart of this movement was a simple but profound message. Respect is a right, not a privilege. It was a principle that extended beyond policing, beyond governance, touching every part of their community. Local schools began holding workshops on empathy and bias, helping young people understand the importance of seeing others as equals. Businesses started hosting community forums where residents could share their thoughts, fostering open dialogues and encouraging a culture of mutual respect. Liam himself became a mentor to some of the young people in town, sharing stories from his time in the military, emphasizing the values of integrity and responsibility. For him, the movement wasn't just about making changes in the present. It was about creating a foundation for the future, instilling values that would prevent the next generation from falling into the same patterns of discrimination and injustice. And through it all, Liam saw the transformation of Officer Reilly. Reilly attended the meetings, participated in training sessions, and volunteered to speak at community forums. He admitted his mistakes openly, sharing his journey with humility, encouraging others to recognize their own biases and confront them. Reilly's willingness to change became an inspiration, a reminder that people could grow, that individuals weren't defined solely by their mistakes. His actions became a testament to the power of redemption and the possibility of genuine reform. One day, during a town hall meeting, Reilly spoke about his own experiences, his own journey of self-discovery. I used to see my badge as a shield, as something that protected me, that gave me authority. But now I understand that it's a responsibility, a commitment to protect others, to serve with integrity, to earn the trust of the people I'm meant to serve. His words resonated deeply, and the crowd applauded, recognizing the courage it took for him to face his own faults and work toward a better future. As the movement continued to grow, the sense of hope in Meadowville was palpable. The community had come together not just to address a single incident, but to tackle a deep-rooted issue, one that affected them all. Through Liam's courage, Reilly's redemption, and the community's resilience, they had created something lasting, a commitment to fairness, to justice, to seeing each person as deserving of respect. Liam concluded his final speech to the community with a powerful message of hope. Real change doesn't come from a single moment. It comes from the choices we make every day, from the commitment we hold to each other, to do better, to be better. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a journey we'll walk together. And I believe, truly, that if we hold on to these values, if we refuse to let go of this determination, we can create a community where everyone feels safe, respected, and seen. As he looked out over the crowd, he saw a town transformed, a place filled not with division but with unity, with a collective drive to create a world built on compassion and justice. The applause that followed was thunderous, a testament to their shared journey, their shared hope. And as Liam walked away from the podium, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that change would require continued effort, patience, and resilience. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, that this community, united by a shared vision, would carry forward the work they had started together. In the end, Meadowville became a place where the memory of that difficult night transformed into a catalyst for growth, a town that stood as a symbol of justice and unity. And as the years passed, it was the commitment of people like Liam, Reilly, and every resident who believed in the power of fairness that allowed the small town of Meadowville to inspire communities across the nation, a reminder that even the most painful experiences could be turned into powerful movements for good.